So far, we have seen that after you identify the astronomical dating in these texts from Revelation, you have essentially two prophecies. The first is the seal judgment on the western half of the empire in the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, and the second is the trumpet judgment on the eastern half of the Roman Empire in the destruction of Antioch, by an earthquake, one with a fire, and the other with a tsunami, both of which occurred. And thus the dual reference, of 115 and 525 AD, was confirmed as real events, in history. In the previous video, you also saw that John's prophecies known as the trumpet judgments, were a prophecy against the home base city, of the Nicolaitan movement. The city of Antioch, Syria. And you saw that this information is known and kept hidden from the public, as a form of esoteric occult knowledge by organizations which endorse a secret, Christ, Antichrist monism, such as the Vatican, and the Freemasons. And you saw that the bishops of Antioch, such as Ignatius, were not even qualified to be bishops according to the New Testament. And you saw that in later centuries, it was recorded that the earlier followers of Christ, in Antioch, did not even consider those bishops in Antioch, to even be believers. These so-called bishops in Antioch, enforced their rule over the people, the same way dictatorships and common street thugs, rule both nations and neighborhoods, using murder, genocides, violence, theft, torture, deceit, and every other evil deed one can possibly imagine at their disposal, without the slightest function of a conscience. And despite the shameless demonic behavior, by these so-called bishops of Antioch, when the judgment of God fell on them, they attempted to hide the demise of their Nicolaitan leader, under the claim he had been raptured, until his skeletal remains were found in a cauldron of pitch, having had the flesh burned off his bones and his head still intact, shocking the entire city, and humiliating his devotees, along with their fraudulent claims of his rapture. In chapter 9, we see some of the most important prophetic information about the coming Nicolaitan Antichrist, recorded by John, so far. Because in chapter 9, he is going to mention by name in two different languages, the real origin and spiritual identification, of Antioch's theological practices. And as you will see, they have nothing to do with Christ, at all. Obviously, if an author repeats something in two different language systems, it is because they are really attempting to bring as much attention to it, as an author possibly could. And yet this very identification, is the very thing, counter-reformation rapture theology will literally bend the text over backwards, to completely ignore. And in Revelation chapter 9, we see once again, an amazingly gross and comical distortion of the biblical text, in order to simply once again, avoid the theological embarrassment, of the more than obvious.
These locusts
gonna be banging at your windows, and it's all you can do to keep them out. They're gonna be coming out of your faucet.
locusts, who can sting like a scorpion.
People say, well, we've never seen anything like this. That's just the point. Yeah, it's like War of the Worlds.
Are going to torment people for 5 months.
This smoke is made of locusts. Friends, these are not ordinary locusts.
These locusts come from the submerged chaos, which is an area underground, and they're released by a spiritual being.
Now this right here is this winged creature.
So we have the first of the three woes, the demon locusts. These locusts are described as locusts. I think they're demon hordes out of the pit, the bottomless pit, and they are as described.
Now they found 2 of them. And if you look, this thing actually has a stinger.
They're obviously demon locusts.
All this is a part of the plan of God. All this demonic plague that's coming on the earth is God's plan.
I'm going to send a demonic army of locusts that sting like scorpions. And they're going to torment you for 5 months.
Locusts who come out of the bottomless pit.
The legs, the feet.
Okay.
But this creature have another, is the wings.
While these scorpions are tormenting these people for 5 months, I guess it's so bad that they want to die, but God won't let them. This demonic army coming out of the bottomless pit is terrifying because they sting, they torment, and I think they bite because it says they have teeth like lions.
Picture giant locusts. They must be giant with scorpions' tails.
We have an X-ray of this creature.
You have an X-ray?
Yes, we have an X-ray.
What did the X-ray show?
And we can see the structure of the bones.
This is totally terrifying. This is worse than anything that man's come up with.
Locusts who come out of the bottomless pit.
Who can sting like a scorpion are going to torment people for 5 months.
welcome you to my biblical teachings on the book of Revelations. Now look at here. The world thinks that they is so smart with all their fancy knowledge that they know what is the world's biggest problems like war and famine and disease and all that. But my Bible tells me that ain't it. The world's biggest problem is pest control. Now, I know a lot of Christians don't realize that is the real problem, but it is. Praise God, hallelujah, amen. You see, the Bible predicts that pest control is going to be the biggest problem in the world. Now, how's that, Dr. Bozo? Well, I'll tell you. I got this as a revelation straight from God, and I read straight out of the Bible too. And that's how I know. The Lord done spoke to me one day and said, Dr. Bozo, the world's biggest problem is pest control. And that's when I saw it. Except when I was in seminary, and they told me that too years earlier, but I didn't remember it till then. And see here, now we is right here in Revelation chapter 9, and the Word of God is telling us about these here demonic locust bugs that is coming to the earth. Now this is all happening because them people were raptured, and they got sent these here demonic locust bugs to torture them for like 5 months. Now, I already hear you saying about asking me about what 5 months. About what's up with the 5 months? Well, I'm gonna tell you. That's another revelation I got that I'm gonna tell you about today. I know precisely why these here locust bugs is gonna pester the world for 5 months. Okay? I know because God done revealed it to me. It was like a revelation. Now, see, but first let's notice. First thing, that God wants to torture people. Okay? He wants to torture people that don't support my ministry. So that's a problem. God is going to torture you people by stinging you with these here demonic locust bugs. And they're going to sting you all over and over and over and over and over. And you're going to go, oh, kill me, you sting me, I want to die, I want to die. But see, God is tough news. God is going to keep you alive just so he can torture you some more. A lot of people think God is love, but that ain't my God. My God wants to torture you, okay? That's the God of my Bible, all right? In fact, my God loves torture, okay? And that is precisely what he's going to do to all them people out there that didn't support this here ministry with their tithes and offerings like they should have, and learned how to get raptured, hallelujah, amen. And there's a lot of them out there. I mean, we should at least have 10% market share, and the only reason we don't is they are wicked. But my God is going to get them, and he's just waiting to torture them, and when he does, it's going to be such a beautiful thing to see them people tortured. And see, them goddamn secular liberals that don't want nobody tortured like in the good-for-nothing Reformation Geneva Conventions, well, they don't read my Bible, because if they did, they would know my God loves to torture people, especially with demonic locust bugs during the tribulation days. After that there rapture, that's why you need to vote for my politician that we bought and put in office, because he's going to torture people too, just like they're supposed to be. But these here locust bugs, see, back to the locust bugs, these here locust bugs, they are not any kind of locust bugs. Now, regular locust bugs can torture you, because I know, because they get on my flowers and my roses in my garden and all that, you know. And I see them through the window and they eat my little roses and everything. I'm like, oh, this is torturing me. I think, oh, Lord, this is torturing me. See these locust bugs eating my flowers? But I go out there and spray them with bug spray, and they all dead. Okay? It's a pretty simple little thing. You just spray them with this bug spray. But these here kind of locust bugs, it won't do no good at all. Call the Orc and Pest Man, because the bug spray of man cannot overcome the power of God to torture you people, okay? And it won't do no good at all, because these here locust bugs is got faces of men and look like horses running into battle. And that's a pretty strange looking locust bug. You see what I'm saying? So I drew you a picture of this locust bug that God is going to send to torture you for not supporting this ministry with your tithes and offerings. Alright? And when an orchid man comes and sprays them with bug spray, they just going to get mad and talk back at you and say, hey man, you can't spray me with no bug spray, because I got a face of a man. You have to use man spray on me, Mr. Orchid Man. And then you're going to have to call like another pest control company, and you're going to have to say like, hey, I got these here demonic bugs in my house, and they stinging me like scorpions, but they got the face of men, and they look like horses prepared for battle. And the orchid man could say, his bug spray don't kill them, because they got to use man spray instead of bug spray, and he killed these here demonic locust bugs sent from hell by God to sting me for 5 months. And that's when the other pest control company's going to say, well now, looky here ma'am, we can't kill no demonic locust bugs from the book of Revelations unless you're willing to try our man bug spray made out of Catholic holy water. But we got to order that all the way from Rome, Italy, and it's going to take at least, guess what, 5 months to get there. 5 months you're going to have to wait on your holy water to come all the way from the Vatican in Italy on a boat across the Indian Ocean and all that. And it's like in the world in tribulation, so you don't have to sit in on the boat because it's like airplanes falling out of the sky because people get raptured and everything. And so it's going to have to come on the boat so it won't fall out of the sky. So it's like if the captain disappears from the boat's still on the water, and somebody else comes up like the sister captain who didn't get the rapture, and he's going to just keep floating on the boat. And so it'll take 5 months to get there. And so the holy water, made out of bugs, the bug spray made out of holy water won't do you no good for 5 months. And now a whole time you're going to be getting stinging and stinging and stinging. Oh, help me. Oh, he stung me again. Oh, Jesus. Help me, Jesus. Help me, Jesus. oh, please stop stinging me, stop stinging me, stop stinging me. It'll be like 5 months. And you can call on the phone and say, please, FedEx, where's my only water man bug spray? It's to kill the locust bug from hell, from the book of Revelations. And he'll say, hey, I'm sorry, man, it's going to take 5 months to get there because we just got your order yesterday. And it takes like a week to get it packed and everything. And it's going to take like another 4 months and then 3 weeks, something like that. And it does, and so it's taking a long time because everybody, and plus we got a bunch of orders backed up and it's like, and so that's what's going to happen. It's going to be 5 months for the UPS and the FedEx to get the holy water man bug spray so you can spray them locust bugs and get rid of them. And that's what's going to happen. That was the revelation God gave me, see. And then, so you see how the problem is? And plus, now, see, there's another problem, too. Because the Pope is going to be very busy during the revelation time. He's going to be doing a lot of work. There's going to be a lot of work to do. And it's going to cost a lot of money to get some water blessed by the Pope. Because he's just not going to have time for it. So the problem is it's going to cost a lot of money if you order your holy water man bug spray for them DEE MONIK locus bugs all the way from Italy. So you got to think about the cost involved if you don't make the rapture. It's going to be really hard for like most people to afford the holy water man bug spray to get rid of the locusts from hell that are going to come and sting you because you didn't do you didn't support this ministry with your tithes and offerings like you should have. And so see now, if you get raptured, you ain't got to worry about because you'll be up in there in the clouds in a Jesus spaceship where you're going to be with things like the grapes and watermelon and chicken and maybe some of that caviar for the rich donors of my ministry. Yep, praise God, hallelujah. That's what's going to happen. Now, so what's it going to be, son? You going to donate to this here ministry and learn from how to get yourself a rapture? Or you going to pay lots of money to get holy water man bug spray from the Pope all the way from Italy after he's gone? Well, that's going to be your choice. That's your choice. But I know one thing. It'd be much cheaper to get you raptured than pay for that holy water man bug spray that's going to have to come all the way from Italy and take 5 months to get to your house. So, here's what you need to do. You need to call right now on the toll-free number on your screen and get your free booklet entitled How I Can Save Money and Not Have to Buy Holy Water Bug Spray for the Locust Man Bugs from the Book of Revelations and Get Tortured by God. Amen. Now see, and in the booklet, it'll tell you all about, like, if you make the rapture, then you ain't got to worry about it. And if you don't make the rapture, you can, like, put a savings account aside, which our financial professionals will help you with, and you can save your money for the bug spray. And you can actually pre-order the bug spray through our ministry. Here at Dr. Bozo's, International Ministries, you can pre-order your Tribulation Days Holy Water Man Bug Spray to kill the locust bugs from hell, and you have it pre-ordered, and then when we all get raptured, and we got it set up to be automatically shipped right away at the beginning of the tribulation, so you will have your supply of holy water man bug spray and get rid of them locust bugs that are going to sting you the rest for 5 months. And they're going to say, I want to die with my holy water man bug spray. Oh, it's going to take 5 months to get here. Oh, I wish I listened to Dr. Bozo and pre-ordered my holy water man bug spray. Because even though I didn't get through the rapture, I didn't support it, and that's why he only had 10% in the market share. But now I'm really sorry, and I wish I had. But at least I got my man bug spray anyway, because I did pre-order it, and now it's coming, and I'll be okay in like a couple of days or something. So you call that toll-free number at the bottom of the screen and get your free booklet right now. And tell it, I can save money and not have to buy holy water bug spray for the locust man bugs from the Book of Revelations and get tortured by God. Amen. Thank you very much. This has been the Dr. Bozo Revelation Hour.
As you can see, the claims of counter-reformation rapture theology are patently ridiculous strangulations of the biblical text in the Book of Revelation. And the extent of stupidity, which counter-reformationists will go to, in order to avoid the obvious intent of the author in these texts, is absolutely comical. Counter-reformationists go to such lengths to avoid the obvious meanings in these texts because, if you acknowledge John is describing an historical timeline, then all of a sudden it identifies them as some of the people John is actually prophesying against. So rather than admit that, they simply contort the texts, until that problem is solved. No matter how extreme, the distortion has to get. But once you realize John is describing an historical timeline, the rest of the Book of Revelation becomes fairly easy to identify. The Book of Revelation is a compilation of 28 separate visions. The visions are grouped around 12 main prophecies, or prophetic sections. Chapter 8 ends in a timeline break in the narrative, and a transition from past and present or near future, to future ages now begin. And as noted earlier, the fifth trumpet begins his prophecies about the Nicolaitan Antichrist coming into full and complete power over the entire Roman Empire, and its consequences in history. Chapter 9 begins John's description of the set of prophecies which cover the future history of the age of the Antichrist, up to the restoration of the nation of Israel, in chapter 13. Chapter 9 through 13 is a running prophetic description of history, beginning with the coming of the Nicolaitan Antichrist at the beginning of chapter 9, and ending with the restoration of the nation of Israel in chapter 13, and covering every major epoch of relevant history, leading up to that event. So it is logically relevant and related. It is not simply John spewing out a bunch of unrelated prophecies about the future, as it is presented by counter-reformationists. Each prophetic statement in this running narrative is related to how the Antichrist is defeated in history, and how Israel comes to be restored in chapter 13. Which is the point of all the prophecies in this section. Remember, John began his prophetic book with Rome's destruction of Israel in the four horsemen and the sealing of millions of martyred from the nation of Israel. Now he is going to chart the history of the Antichrist, how he is defeated, and how those martyrs did not die in vain, but will see their sacrifices culminate in the defeat of the empire and the restoration of the nation of Israel. Chapter 13 ends this prophetic section, and then chapter 14 will begin the next section. Understanding that John is describing a series of groups of visions in his writing, will help the reader to understand that the texts in these groups of visions are related to each point in the group of visions. It provides additional context to the reader. For example, if you are reading about a vision of an elephant, the sentence, quote, "I see a large trunk," end quote, helps you realize that is a statement relative to the context of discussing an elephant, not sunken treasure in the Caribbean. This is another common error that counter-reformation theology actually depends on, in order to make its claims. They intentionally try to lift things out of their literary context, in order to claim they are actually referring to whatever they come up with in their imagination about the future. That John, in reality, was making no mention of whatsoever. As we have done previously, we will first go through these chapters and reconstruct John's astronomically dated, historical timeline. Then we will look at events on the ground he describes from the language, and see what he was actually prophesying. After that, we will compare them to what we know of history, to see what John was actually referencing in his prophecy. Revelation chapter 9 contains two main prophecies. The first prophecy is from verses 1 through 12 and the second prophecy is from verse 13 through verse 21. Both of these prophecies are about the rise of two different armies. The first army in verse 1 through 12 is described physically, along with its origin of authority, its military innovations in history, and what it does to Europe. The second army is described in verse 13 through 20. And once again, John provides a physical description, where they originate geographically, and what they will do to Western civilization, and in particular, the First Army. As you will soon see, John's astronomically dated timeline places these events squarely in the period of history known as the Middle Ages, or the Dark Ages, as they used to be called. Once we look at these texts in detail, you will see there is no room for counter-reformation's end-of-the-world claims that these texts have anything to do with demonic locusts that live in the center of the earth and turn people into undead zombies, incapable of dying. Which is pretty much what they are claiming. Instead of a freakish otherworldly invasion by zombie-producing demonic locusts from the center of the earth, this text has a very real, very down-to-earth, and very historical subject matter, which is quite easily identified with a little reading and some history. But counter-reformationists would rather turn you into a medieval ignoramus straight from the Dark Ages, than admit the meaning of what is in Revelation chapter 9. Because it serves as a biblical repudiation of pretty much their entire political agenda of restoring the Holy Roman Empire, also known as the Roman Reich. Chapter 9 has fixed astronomical dating in reference to two events only. The first fixed astronomical dating reference is found in chapter 9 verse 1, and describes the fall of a meteor to the earth with an impact. The second fixed astronomical date occurs in verse 13 in reference to what was previously identified as the constellation era, or Latin for altar. After the first fixed dating event, John lists a series of historical events. They are not necessarily in any kind of chronological order, but they are grossly listed after the event of verse 1. The same thing occurs after verse 13. But these two fixed references do give a concrete location on his timeline for the historical events which he prophesied will follow. There are 3 verses that appear to have specific information concerning John's astronomically dated timeline. The first 2 are in verse 5 and verse 10. They mention a period of 5 months or 150 days. On first glance they appear to be time conversion values. And while they are time conversion values, unfortunately, they do not help locate John's timeline because the beginning of their time frame is not specified. They could occur at any point on his timeline. The only information provided is their duration. The third reference is to 4 angels bound at the Euphrates being loosed. But because the reference point is a geographical location on Earth, not in the sky, these are not astronomical events. They are geopolitical historical events on the ground. So the only date they provide is the one of their actual occurrence as history. But before we look at the 2 references for John's fixed astronomical dating in this chapter, there is unfinished business from Revelation chapter 7 and 8 that we need to address first. The reason we need to begin dating chapter 9 by finishing the dating references in chapter 8 is that the astronomical dating for the first fixed reference point actually begins in chapter 8. Without that final dating reference point in chapter 8, we may not know where on the timeline John is actually placing chapter 9. Counter-reformationists simply stick it anywhere in the future from today. As long as it is within their imaginary 7 years of tribulation, they seem to think its location is fine, despite how the texts are actually anchored to a very historical context. And they do this even if it ignores or violates every dating reference in the text. Beginning in chapter 7, John establishes a dual date reference for his prophecy in chapter 8. The 2 dates create a parenthesis on the prophetic timeline. The first and primary being 115 AD, and the second being 476 AD, which was the fall of the Roman Empire, and the subsequent destruction of the city of Antioch by earthquake fire cataclysm in 525 AD. It would be only logical for the reader, after seeing these 2 time conversion dates in chapter 7, to wonder what was going to happen in the middle of this parenthesis. If we take the second date of 476 AD and minus the year 115 AD, then divide the result by 2, we will find out what would be the midpoint of those 2 references, and we get around the year 296, or around the turn of the 3rd century. If we take the actual event date of 525 and repeat the same calculation, then divide the result by 2, we get the midpoint of 320 AD. So we are looking at a range of approximately 24 years from 296 to 320 AD, which mark a midpoint on John's timeline between these 2 prophetic dates. So what happens around this midpoint on John's timeline? It is obviously very important to his narrative, because he places a prophetic parenthesis around it to bring the reader's attention to it. John is now about to fill in that blank, and answer that very question, in his next chapter, which we are going to look at now. John logically addresses that blank, with his very next statement, transitioning events into chapter 9 and into the 5th and 6th trumpets. Chapter 9 begins with a closing comment of chapter 8 verse 13, in which John states the following, quote, "And I beheld, and heard, an angel, flying through the midst of heaven, saying with a loud voice, Woe, 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 to the inhabitants of the land, by reason of the other voices, of the trumpet, of the 3 angels, which are yet to sound." End quote. We have just discussed how the dual prophetic reference in chapter 8 creates a parenthetical clause on the prophetic timeline between 115 AD and 525 AD. And we have, out of curiosity, just measured the exact midpoint of that prophetic parenthesis. Now ironically but not incidentally, before the close of chapter 8, John actually makes a direct reference to that midpoint, indicating he is about to begin the timeline for chapter 9 at that very same parenthetical midpoint. We have already seen that the midpoint in John's timeline, or his prophetic parenthesis, would place us somewhere between 296 AD and 320 AD. But here in chapter 8 verse 13, along with that reference to the midpoint, we are also given a time conversion statement. As we have seen in the previous videos, John uses redundancy to confirm his timeline values. So the reader will end up around the same place on his timeline, through 2 or 3 different ways of estimating the same point. Here he gives us 2 different references again. The most obvious reference is the simple reference to mid-heaven or the midpoint. He is referring to more than simply the astronomical event in that statement, because all astronomical events occur in the middle of the sky. Otherwise you can't see them because of trees and horizon clutter. John is being very specific about an exact midpoint, but it's not in the physical sky, it's in the sky of his timeline, and if you have already discovered his dual reference, then his reference to the midpoint, or 90 degrees in the middle, becomes an obvious reference to the center of the prophetic parenthesis, on his astronomical timeline in the sky. And it is in that sense, it is in the mid-heaven of the sky. Or in other words, 90 degrees center, in his astronomical timeline, observed in the sky. But he also provides a second time conversion statement, as well, to get you to the same place, just in case you completely miss his reference. And that second time conversion statement will bring us to literally the very same approximate place on his timeline. If you actually look at the sentence in chapter 8 verse 13, you will notice this is a very oddly constructed sentence. It is packed with way too many items of reference, and grammatically, is known as a poorly constructed run-on sentence. If John constructed a sentence that has too many items in it, then obviously for some reason, John was trying to bring attention to the number of items in the sentence. This is quite significant, because we already know John is using time conversions in his texts, and this statement is an obvious reference to a time frame. Time conversions sound complicated, but they are always very simplistic calculations and come from the most obvious elements in the text. We have 3 very obvious elements. First, we have the obvious number of items he lists, which make the sentence a run-on sentence. When we count those items up, they come to the number 8. Then we have the obvious 3 woes he is talking about in the text. So now we have 8 times 3. And lastly we have the subject matter of the trumpets, which in total are 7. 7 is also a background number to virtually all John's calculations throughout the book. So we end up with a very simplistic time conversion value of 8 times 3 times 7. When we multiply that together, it gives us the time conversion value of 168, meaning 168 years. If we have calculated that correctly, it should place us within the prophetic parenthesis on John's timeline in approximately the same place he has already indicated. Therefore our time conversion value from this text is 168 years, which begins after the appearance of the angel. In John's use of terminology, we know he is referencing an astronomical event by the appearance of this angel. So now we have the length of time, from the appearance of the angel or astronomical event, to the beginning of the timeline that is coming in chapter 9. And we know that event should fall within the range of 296 AD to 320 AD, or 168 years later. The only problem is that we do not have the date of the appearance of the angel in the text. And for that we have to look at history, to see when this astronomical event actually occurred. It is clear from the language in chapter 8 verse 13, John is describing the appearance of an asteroid or a comet. Something that would be seen in the sky very easily. If we go forward in history from 115 AD, and the Antioch earthquake and tsunami, looking for the appearance of a very obvious asteroid or comet in the sky, we discover that the most obvious and brightest of all objects in the sky matching this description, occurred in the year 141 AD. It was an unusually bright appearance of Halley's Comet. How do we know it was unusually bright? Because there are historical records of its appearance. It was seen across the world, and ancient astronomers actually recorded their observation of it from Europe to Asia. Asian astronomers recorded its appearance was unusually bright in the sky, and impossible to miss. And this event occurred in 141 AD, or approximately 25 years later after the fourth trumpet judgment in Antioch. If we take the year 141 AD, and add our time conversion value of 168 years which John gave us in chapter 8 verse 13, we discover that 141 plus 168 equals the year 312 AD. And that is almost right in the middle of our 24-year range created by John's prophetic parenthesis. So now let's go forward into chapter 9, and find out what John was trying to bring the reader's attention to, which he says will happen around the year 312 AD. This brings us to the very first verse in chapter 9. In the very first verse of chapter 9, John provides the rest of the information about this event, which he sees occurring around the year 312 AD. John is going to describe a second astronomically dated event. He describes another fairly huge astronomical event, which should be seen visibly in the sky, once again, sometime around 312 AD. His description reads as follows, quote, "And the fifth angel sounded, and I saw a star fall from heaven unto the earth, and to him was given the key of the bottomless pit. And he opened the bottomless pit. And there arose a smoke out of the pit, as the smoke of the great furnace. And the sun and the air were darkened by reason of the smoke of the pit." End quote. There is a lot of information in that text and we will break it down for you in the next section. But here, we are simply attempting to get an idea of astronomical events which will mark his timeline, and we notice John describes a star, not a megastar. If you remember from earlier, the term megastar, or megastar, indicated a constellation falling on the horizon. Here however, he uses simply a star or star, and follows his reference with the description of a physical impact on the Earth. He describes the impact being sizable enough to create a visible atmospheric fallout which darkens the sky and the sun. And we can expect to see this event sometime after midheaven or midpoint, referring to around the year 312 AD. So let's mark the beginning of John's astronomically dated timeline with a large meteor impact around 312 AD, which begin the events of chapter 9. We see the astronomical event clearly enough in verse 1, which then are followed by a series of several events. There is however no timeline information given about them until we get to verse 5, and then we are given another time conversion reference. John uses the reference 5 months, or 5 times 30. 5 times 30 equals 150, meaning 150 years. The English translates the term as torment, but the Greek word used in this text is the Greek word, bon-enzo, which literally means torture. We do not have any information about how much time passes from the first event, which we are expecting to see around 312 AD, and the events which follow leading up to verse 5. This is a section of blank time frame space filled in only by a list of developments. And then another odd thing occurs. 5 verses later, in verse 10, we come to a virtual repeat of his earlier statement of 5 months, or 150 years again, precisely 5 verses later. Most consider this simply a repeat of his earlier statement, and give it no additional meaning other than that, but the two references are not simply a repeat of the same event. They are two different events which repeat the same patterns. But we have no information given other than the length of their durations, so they cannot be located on the timeline by anything other than their actual occurrence. And as you saw in earlier videos, when dealing with prophetic material, the chronology of the immediate text in a prophecy does not necessarily carry over to the chronology of their actual fulfillment in history, which can be fulfilled as sporadic events separated by centuries or progressive trends that are culminated over a long period of time. But we do have another, or second campaign, of torture that John is making a prophetic reference to, which will also last 150 years on his timeline. Not one, but two, major historical markers, in reference to torture, that he gives the prophetic timeline value of 150 years to. He doesn't specify if that 150 years is consecutive or concurrent to the previous one, but it is subsequent in time. But, the fact he mentions the same exact value twice, definitely indicates he wants the reader's attention on the meaning of that numeric figure. We will go through these texts in more detail in the next section, demonstrating their meanings are fairly unmistakable. But right now, we are simply attempting to construct the possible timeline values. So the fifth trumpet, according to John, would begin around 312 AD and be marked by astronomical events involving first, the appearance of a comet or asteroid in the sky, which did occur in 141 AD, and then 168 years later, will be followed by a fairly large meteor impact in 312 AD. Was there a fairly large meteor impact around 312 AD? Yes, there actually was. It was precisely in 312 AD, and it is directly connected to what John is prophesying in history in this text, as you will soon see, in just a moment. These events will fulfill the fifth trumpet judgment, which he makes a specific point in saying verbatim in verse 12. Stating afterwards, one woe has passed. Once these events occur in history, the woe in this prophecy is fulfilled. And it is done. And this completes John's astronomical dating for the first prophecy. The next prophecy and woe begins with another astronomical dating event. John refers to the four horns of the altar again. Previously, you saw that was a reference to the constellation era, which is Latin for altar. So after the events of verses 9 through 11, we will be looking for an astronomical event in the constellation era. If you remember, the constellation era, or the altar, where John saw the martyrs dressed in white, is just beneath the constellation Scorpio. Venus and Scorpio during the seal judgments indicated the coming of the green horse. The meteor shower in Scorpio and era were John's vision of the martyrs clothed in white. Scorpions had been a major topic of conversation in his preceding verses, and it is not by accident that he is now drawing attention to the constellation era in Scorpio, for his astronomical event dating sign. If we go forward in time from 312 AD, looking for a major astronomical event in the constellation era Scorpio, we find amazingly, in the year 824 AD, a very large double meteor shower occurred, precisely where John said to look for it. It was large enough to have been chronicled by Asian astronomers with commentary. And this occurred in the year 824 AD. John prophetically marks his timeline with this event, and he says when his readers see this event, four angels or messenger will be loosed at the river Euphrates. As pointed out earlier, the term angel simply means messenger and can refer to anything. We are also told that the four messengers which are loosed at the Euphrates have been preparing an invasion for an hour, and a day, and a month, and a year. So these four messengers are a reference to something involving a military invasion, not an astronomical event. When you add up all the time frame values John gives, and translate the resulting figure to years, which you can find in many old commentaries, you will get 396 years. So from the time of the astronomical event in the constellation era under Scorpio, in keeping with all his references to scorpions, after the events of the fifth seal, we can count 396 years, and we should expect to see the invasion of a substantial army, coming from east of the Euphrates. And that concludes John's astronomical dating for chapter 9. If you simply add up all John's time frame values found in chapter 9, we get 312 AD plus 300 years of torture plus 396 years of preparation for an invasion, which places us around the year 969 AD at the earliest. And if we add 150 years each for the two blank time frame spaces between the mention of 5 months, since those are the time frames John overtly cites, we'd get somewhere around 969 to 1269 AD. But the precise dates will become even more clear when we begin to compare these texts with the actual historical events John has prophesied. None of these events involve the end of the world, demonic locust bugs from the center of the earth, or modern armies from either China or Russia. Once you see how clear John's prophecies are in chapter 9, you will no longer be fooled by the fictions of counter-reformationists on these texts. Now let's go back through these texts, and find out exactly what John was actually prophesying down to the letter of the texts. Then let's finish constructing the details of his timeline, based on what we find out from his text and how it compares to actual history. In the next video, we will dig into the text of Revelation chapter 9 verses 1 through 12 and see the details of what John prophesied in the fifth trumpet judgment. You will also see why the counter-reformation is so desperate to hide the actual contents of these texts from the public. And precisely why, not only you, but your entire family and everyone you care about, should know the truth about them. What the counter-reformation is attempting to hide in Revelation chapter 9, is in reality, much scarier than demonic locusts bugs from the center of the earth. It describes instead, a demonic power, that will rule the earth and bring untold misery upon its millions of victims, in one of the worst periods of human history ever known to mankind, the Dark Ages. And as hard as this may be for some to believe, in the modern world, it is by no accident, that it is precisely this very same period of history, that the Counter-Reformation is working day and night, through the most powerful religious, financial and political institutions in the Western world, through every means available, to restore to the earth today. Don't miss the exciting details of John's real prophecy about the future of the Roman Empire, from 96 AD, and what it can reveal to you, today. Thank you for watching.